From the green caves under the sea, Thetis arose to comfort her son, but in vain, since all her magical powers could not restore him Patroclus. In my anger against King Agamemnon, groaned Achilles, I have sent out my friend alone to his death. What is Briseis compared to Patroclus, whose very body I cannot now rescue, unarmed as I am? Alas, my son, said the goddess, clasping him in her arms, do not kill yourself with grief for a mortal man whose end was appointed by the fates when he was born. I do not care whether I live or die, since my anger and pride have brought death on my dearest friend. My only hope is revenge. Tears sprang to the eyes of the goddess for her son, who was at once her joy and her sorrow. At least stay out of the battle today, while I go to Olympus and beg the lame smith, Hephaestus himself, to make you now armor in place of which Hector has stripped from Patroclus. Tomorrow you may go forth to war. I must look now, cried he, starting up suddenly. Perhaps at this very moment Hector is bearing off the body of Patroclus in triumph. He rushed toward the gateway in the wall, while the goddess sped up through the clouds to Olympus, where the house of Hephaestus shone with hammered silver and gold. Achilles stood by the edge of the moat unarmored, but huge as a giant, looking out at the battle on the plain. 3 times he cried aloud in his grief and his rage, while the light of the setting sun behind him outlined his figure with fire. So terrible was he to the Trojans that they shrank back in dismay, relinquishing the body of Patroclus, which was now buried under men and broken spears. As the battle paused, the sun plunged under the horizon. The baffled Trojans, retreating to their position of the night before, took counsel. We must go back to the city, cried Polydamas. While we have the chance, tomorrow Achilles will fall, raging upon us and scatter us like leaves. Go back? Cried Hector. I say no. Today we have stormed into the camp, fired a ship, and killed or wounded the greater part of the chieftains. Are you all afraid of one man? If so, I will face him alone, for I stand on a height of glory from which no man shall cast me down. Very well, answered Polydamas gloomily. But the blood of those who fall tomorrow at the hands of Achilles will be on your head. During this while the Greeks were making a bier for the body of Patroclus, and when the women had washed and anointed him, they laid him upon it, as handsome as he had been during life. The other heroes then scattered to their tents to rest, but Achilles mourned all night long, sleepless from rage and grief. That same night, in his palace on Olympus, Hephaestus was toiling over armor of bronze inlaid with silver and gold. He made first a great shield covered with pictures. There was a city at war upon it, and a city at peace. Men were breaking ground with a plow, and at the ends of their furrows boys were waiting with cups of wine to refresh them. Reapers were cutting wheat with sharp sickles, while boys behind them gathered it up and gave it to the binders. Men and women were bringing home with grapes in plated baskets. Youths and maidens were dancing, their hands upon one another's wrists. All these pictures and more were on the shield of Achilles, together with which the god made a breastplate brighter than a flame of fire. Next he fashioned greaves of pliant metal and a massive helmet crested with gold. Dawn approached as he gave the glistening armor to Thetis, who darted down from the peaks of Olympus like a falling star. Men awoke and were summoned to an assembly in which Agamemnon once more offered Briseis and great treasures to Achilles if he would put his anger aside. Keep the girl or return her as you wish, said Achilles indifferently, looking at him with red eyes and pale, terrible face. Who is she that 2 kings should quarrel for her, a captive and a slave? Forget her, and let us arm for battle. I burn for revenge. I wronged you, and I will return the girl and give treasure besides, answered Agamemnon with decision. When we have eaten, we will go out to bathe. Eat if you must, but eat quickly. I have no need of food. Soon the Greeks poured out of their huts and in their glittering armor, thick as snowflakes, hovering in the winter air. Far overhead, Athena shouted aloud, while opposite her Ares, terrible as a black storm, shook his vast spear. Zeus thundered from heaven until the mountains quivered, and far below the dark halls of the dead trembled with the shock. Achilles rushed out to war like a wounded lion, driven on by his pain and his fury to kill or die. First he fell upon Iones, whose last hour would have come had not the gods snatched him away in the mist, for he was destined to survive the sack of his city and to found a new race of Trojans who should rule over the world. Achilles, thus foiled, leaped forward again, and men gave way before him, since to stand in his path was death. In front of him, by chance, ran a boy little more than a child. He was Priam's youngest and dearest son, whom the old man had forbidden to enter the battle. The lad, however, was daring and would run up behind the fighters to throw his light spear, trusting in his swiftness to escape before he could be caught. As the warriors now parted before the onset of Achilles, the boy was exposed for a moment full in the slayer's path. Before this time, Achilles had spared many a lad and let them go for a ransom, but now he had no pity left. He hurled his heavy javelin, heard the boy's shrill cry as he fell, and rushed on like fire through a forest, destroying as he came. Achilles drove the Trojans back to the banks of the yellow Scamander, where a portion of them were hemmed in by a bend of the river, and took to the water in search of escape. Leaping down the steep bank, sword in hand, he slew until the reddened stream was choked with the bodies of the dead. One young man climbed back up the bank, but too late, for the destroyer saw him. The youth dropped his weapon and fell at his enemy's feet. "Spare me!" he cried. "I am Lycaon, whom you caught once before upon Ida and sold into slavery over the sea. I was found at last and brought back at a great price by my father. 12 days ago I reached Troy. Only 12 days. Have pity on me." "Fool," said Achilles, raising his sword with grim purpose. "Do you think there is mercy left in my heart for a brother of Hector?" He struck, and the young man fell back down the bank to be swept away by the eddying stream. At last the waters were choked with the dead, and the river god himself lifted up his voice from the depths, crying to Achilles to cease. He, however, slew on until the river in rage burst its banks and roared down upon him, seeking to sweep him away. Achilles grasped at a tree and struggled painfully out of the torrent. He turned toward Troy to pursue the main body of Trojans, who were in the flight across the plain. Old Priam, from the tower by the gateway in Troy, called to the guards to fling the gates wide and hold them open as long as they dared. Soon the entry was crowded with chariots and men racing for safety, while as yet Achilles was still far off, chasing stragglers over the plain. In confusion, none noticed that one man had leaped from his chariot and rushed out again through the gateway. Priam saw him first as he turned to the wall again and looked out. Alone in the plain stood Hector, spear in hand, awaiting Achilles. Priam leaned out over the wall and called to his son, "Come back, Hector! If you perish, what hope is left for me and for Troy? Remember my age and my sorrows and spare me this worst blow of all." The wind sweeping over the battlements blew the sound of the old man's cry away. If his son Hector heard, he did not answer, for he was half mad with shame and grief because his rashness had exposed the Trojans to disaster. He remembered how he had promised to face Achilles himself, and the words of Polydamas' answer still rung in his ears. "The blood of those who fall at the hands of Achilles will be on your head." The huge and dazzling figure of Achilles was racing for his enemy. Defeat had crushed the exultation of the Trojan hero, so that once more he saw clearly and knew that his death was at hand. It was easier to face death in battle than to wait for it calmly. Suppose I put off my shield and my helmet, meet Achilles unarmed, and fall at his knees. I can promise him Helen and all the wealth of our city in ransom, since the elders will carry out what I command. Thus he thought to himself for a moment, but the answer came quickly. Achilles would slay me, unarmed like a woman, and in death I should be put to shame. As though the very thought had unnerved him, he turned to run back to safety, where the darts of the Trojans from the wall could cover him. Achilles, however, who was now close upon him, cut sideways across his path and drove him outward from the wall. Now Hector fled round the walls of Troy with Achilles after him. Past the station of the watchmen they went, past the wagon track, the great fig tree, and the pools of eddying Scamander where the women washed their clothes. None dared come out from the city to help, and no Greek rushed to the aid of Achilles, for he had motioned them all to stand aside. 3 times around the city the two raced for the life of Hector. Mighty was he who fled, but the pursuer was greater far. At last, when Hector saw there was no escape, he turned on his enemy. Achilles also halted, and in the pause the Trojan spoke. "Achilles, if I have the fortune to kill you, I will give back your body to the Greeks for burial, and do you not do the same by mine?" "You are mad to talk of bargains to me," said Achilles, glaring furiously upon him. "Does the sheep make terms with the wolf?" He raised his arm and hurled his great spear. Hector crouched so that the weapon flew over his shoulder. He threw in his turn and hit the shield of Achilles, but the spear rebounded from the armor made by a god. Hector drew his sword and leaped forward desperately to come to close quarters, but Achilles met him with a fierce thrust in the neck between the breastplate and the helmet. Hector fell with a crash in the dust. "Hector," exulted Achilles, "when you were killing Patroclus, you thought yourself safe because I was not there. Now dogs and birds shall devour you, while Patroclus lies buried in state." "Give back my body to my father," murmured Hector faintly. "I beg and implore you to let me be buried so that my spirit may go to the land of the blessed dead." "Dog!" cried Achilles, glorying in his revenge. "Priam shall not buy back your body if you offer your weight in gold. Beasts shall devour you unburied, and your spirit shall wander for ages without end." "Savage that you are!" gasped Hector. "Beware the anger of the gods. It is not long before Paris and Phoebus Apollo shall slay you on the threshold of the Scaean gate." After this prophecy, Hector's limbs relaxed as the shadow of death came over him. His soul fled forth from his body, wailing its lost vigor and youth. Achilles looked down on the corpse. Revenge was short, and now it was over. But it had not restored him Patroclus. He needed more vengeance. Rapidly he stripped the corpse of its armor and tied it by the feet to his chariot. He drove round Troy, dragging Hector in the dust before the eyes of the dead man's parents and wife who stood on the walls. Even so, Hector's death brought no consolation. In the green caves under the water, Thetis wept all night long to hear her son groaning and calling upon the spirit of his friend. Briseis was regained, but Patroclus, who was far more beloved, was lost to him utterly. He could not accept this, but at last he said to himself, "I will at least give Patroclus a funeral, such as no hero has had hitherto." With that thought he was comforted a little. "I shall be at peace when that is done," said he.